Hey, good morning, class. Welcome in. We are going to once again have kind of a lot of discussions all wrapped into one. Last time we took a look at the European theater of war. Took a look at the end of Nazi Germany. Now we're going to take a look at the Holocaust and the Pacific theater of war. So a lot to kind of unroll here and kind of learn about. So I want to make sure we take the proper steps to learn each of these events. So let's go into the Holocaust first, and we will start out with this, okay? So, if we remember, the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, taking place in the late 1930s, Jews began to realize that violence against them was likely to increase. By the end of 1939, a number of German Jews began to flee to other nations. Many, however, remained in Germany. Later, Hitler conquered territories where millions of Jews lived. At first, Hitler wanted to force emigration against the Jews. This was to be a solution for what he called the Jewish problem. After admitting thousands of German Jews, nations like Great Britain, France, and the United States abruptly closed their doors for further immigration. So they basically closed things off. And this was disastrous. When Hitler found out that they could not get rid of the Jews through immigration, he put another plan in place. In the territories that he controlled, remember, Germany moving left and right all over the place into new areas, he ordered all Jews to be moved to designated cities. These cities were known as ghettos. They became overcrowded, they were segregated, they were, again, tough living conditions. Essentially, again, these were not places that anyone wanted to live. The Nazis then sealed off these cities with barbed wire and stone walls. They hoped that the Jews would starve to death or die from disease. Despite the horrible conditions, the Jews persevered in the ghettos and formed resistance organizations. In the ghettos, the Jewish community did everything that they could to preserve their traditions, produce plays and concerts to teach students, and record everything that was going on around them. Therefore, people would be able to understand what was going on. So you see recording, you see writing taking place as all these events are unfolding. Hitler became impatient waiting for the Jews to starve in the ghettos. He decided to take more of a direct plan of action. This was known as the final solution. The final solution was a systematic genocide of the Jewish people. In his plans of conquest, Hitler wanted to purify the Aryan race. To protect racial purity, Hitler wanted to eliminate other races, nationalities, and any group that the Nazis deemed to be inferior. This included gypsies, Poles, Russians, homosexuals, the insane, disabled, and the mentally ill. But the Nazis primarily focused on the Jews. As the Nazis began to sweep through Europe and the Soviet Union, the killings began. Units from the SS, the Schutzstaffel, began to move from town to town to hunt down Jews. The SS rounded up men, women, children, and the elderly and shot them in isolated spots. Jews not killed by the killing squads were then sent to concentration camps. These were slave labor camps and were found mostly in Germany and Poland. Camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald had thousands of Jews. Hitler hoped that the horrible conditions of the camps would eliminate the Jews. The prisoners would work 7 days a week as slaves for the SS or German businesses. Meals included thin soup, scraps of bread, and potato peelings, hardly anything at all. Most Jews lost over 50 pounds in a few months. Hunger was so intense that the prisoners did whatever they could to get small amounts of food. Hitler's war against the Jews amplified in 1942. The Nazis built extermination camps that had massive gas chambers. Up to 6,000 people would be killed in a day. When prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, they would be paraded in front of doctors. These doctors would conduct cruel experiments and would determine which prisoners were weak. Those that were weak were to be executed that day. They were told to shower, but in reality they were being deceived and sent to the gas chambers. The Nazis would then use large crematoriums and burn the bodies. Around 6 million Jews died in these death camps. Fewer than 4 million survived. Some escaped the horrors of the camps with the help of non-Jewish people. These rescuers would hide Jews in their homes or would help them escape to other nations. Those who survived the Holocaust would tell their story in literature, poetry, and news outlets. We look at Anne Frank's diary. We look at the book Night by Elie Wiesel. These are some examples of what was going on at the time. Today, the Holocaust remains one of the most horrific events in human history. It is essential to educate and inform people of these horrors. Too many conspiracy theories and too many Holocaust deniers are around right now and have emerged in the last decade. And again, it is alarming and it is terrifying to see that a rise in anti-Semitism has started to pick back up again. Okay. Now, we want to shift gears and we're going to actually move into Imperial Japan once again. So we're going to take a look at the Pacific Theater of War and see how things unfold there. So, again, we're going to take a look at Pearl Harbor to open things up here. Due to the oil embargo, remember, the United States created that oil embargo against Japan. Japan secretly wanted to attack the United States. They felt that the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii would be the perfect location to launch an attack. Led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. American officials had decoded messages about a potential attack, but were unaware of when and where the attack would occur. More than 2,300 Americans lost their lives and over 1,100 were wounded. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated it was a date which will live in infamy, and a formal declaration of war was accepted by Congress. Now, understand this. In the blink of an eye, the United States was now in World War II, but they were lacking troops, resources, materials, and equipment due to neutrality. Enlistment numbers went to nearly 2.2 million troops in a matter of months. Families began to donate everything they could to the war effort. American troops needed rigorous training before they hit the battlefields as well. Industries shifted their production into weapons of war. Okay. In response to Pearl Harbor, the United States set up several internment camps in the western United States that held between 110,000 to 120,000 Japanese Americans. These Japanese Americans were forced to live a life of detention simply because of their Japanese ancestry. The United States feared espionage and coordinated attacks from within the Japanese American population. This is one of the darker aspects of World War II and shows the racism and anti-Japanese rhetoric that spread throughout the United States. Okay? Again, here's an image and a depiction of the Japanese internment camp, which is held out west. Now, early on in the Pacific, the Japanese were able to swiftly win at Guam and Wake Island. The next prize was the Philippines. Now, the Japanese invaded Manila, which is the capital, and began to conquer both the Americans and the Filipinos that lived there. The Japanese also struck Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. These Dutch and British territories were overrun by Japanese power. Back to the Philippines, the Japanese conducted the Bataan Death March against the prisoners. This was a grueling 50-mile march that saw between 5,000 and 18,000 deaths. Allied retaliation. In April of 1942, the United States countered with the Doolittle raids. These were quick attacks over Tokyo with B-25 bombers. Although little damage was inflicted, these had huge psychological effects against the Japanese. Plus, it boosted Allied morale. Japanese leaders had felt that they may have spread their empire too thin, meaning they had too many troops in too many locations to be effective. The United States would win a critical battle at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. This was a key turning point in the war because the United States was able to decimate the Japanese Navy. 332 planes, 4 aircraft carriers, and 1 support ship were knocked out. Again, here's the Battle of Midway. And now, all of a sudden, we have this concept of what we call island hopping. The Allies under General Douglas MacArthur were now on the offensive. All right? He would conduct a strategy of island hopping. The goal of island hopping was to conquer a Japanese-held island at a time. One at a time was the goal. Then establish a base and an airstrip to get closer and closer to the mainland of Japan. Guadalcanal became the first island on MacArthur's list. The United States gained the airfield, but at a huge cost. Over 6 months of fighting during the Battle of Guadalcanal led to 24,000 Japanese deaths, and the United States would lose over 7,000 troops. On the island, the Japanese resorted to resilient and desperate tactics that would be used for the remainder of the war in the Pacific. Okay. Now, to wrap things up here, all right, after the Allied victory at Guadalcanal, Japanese advancements stopped. The Japanese were now in retreat, and they became incredibly desperate. The Japanese began to use a kamikaze strategy. In Japan, this term means the divine wind. Essentially, Japanese fighter jets would nosedive into Allied ships on purpose. These suicide pilots did everything in their power to kill as many Americans as possible. The Japanese would seek refuge in the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Now, in March of 1945, the Japanese would hunker down on the rocky island of Iwo Jima. Riddled with caves and difficult terrain, the Japanese fought a brutal battle that inflicted heavy American casualties. On April 1st, the Japanese then moved to the island of Okinawa. Here, over 100,000 Japanese troops died and over 12,000 Americans lost their lives. Americans were now faced with a dilemma. Should they conduct a full-scale invasion of Japan, which is known as Operation Downfall, or find a new way to win the war? Again, here's Iwo Jima and Operation Downfall, this projected invasion of Japan. Now, what we see here is the Potsdam Declaration. This is going to be basically calling for Japanese unconditional surrender and an end to militarism in Japan. This was issued on July 26, 1945 by Harry S. Truman. Now, in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had passed away, so Harry S. Truman became president. If Japan did not surrender, it would face prompt and utter destruction. Japan refused the declaration. The USA did not want to invade Japan. They reasoned that using the atomic bomb would deliver a huge blow to Japan. This would save the lives of thousands of American troops, and the U.S. wanted to end the war with limited American casualties. And the U.S. wanted to test their 2 new bombs. So, again, behind all of this, the grand scheme of things, the Manhattan Project is occurring. This is a secret U.S. project to create the first atomic weapon. The bombs were made of uranium and plutonium isotopes. All right, here is Robert Oppenheimer and Leslie Groves at the Trinity test site. Now, what targets were going to be chosen? There were 4 targets to choose from: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Niigata. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were selected because they were left mostly untouched during the war. Now, Hiroshima was the primary target on August 6, 1945. The B-29 Enola Gay, followed by other B-29s, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil. Now, on August 6, 1945, Paul W. Tibbets and his crew would drop the uranium-based bomb on Hiroshima. This gun-like made bomb was nicknamed Little Boy. 60 kilograms of uranium-235 equaled 13 kilotons of TNT. Okay? In the aftermath, roughly 70,000 people perished in Hiroshima. By the end of 1945, between 90,000 and 160,000 people died of related diseases and basically died from the radiation from this atomic bomb. Between 1950 and 2000, 46% of leukemia deaths and 11% of solid cancer deaths among survivors were due to the radiation that was left from the bombs. Okay? Now, the Japanese had not surrendered after August 6th. They had not surrendered after the attack on Hiroshima. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, the U.S. B-29 Superfortress boxcar, flown by Charles W. Sweeney and his crew, would drop Fat Man. And the Fat Man bomb was 6.4 kilogram plutonium-239, and it was 21 kilotons of TNT. In the aftermath, the death toll of all related deaths was about 135,000. Again, a lot of deformities, a lot of mutations erupted from the atomic energy from these bombs. All right, here you can see, again, the bomb was so powerful that it essentially vaporized people and that their shadows were imprinted on walls and on the floors. Oh, lights out. Okay, Japan formally surrendered to the Allied powers on August 14, 1945. Emperor Hirohito accepted the Potsdam Declaration. With Japan formally surrendering, they're going to actually do it on the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. In total, over 75 to 80 million people died in World War II. This was roughly 3% of the entire world population. And now we are left in a world that is going into the unknown. And there's going to be 2 world superpowers that are going to emerge: the United States and the Soviet Union. And the post-World War II world is going to be very complex. That is going to be filled with even more death and destruction. Okay? All right, folks, I appreciate you paying attention. Take care of yourselves. Have a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.